The low foothills. Everything was ready on the morning of June 5th, and the lorry, which was to convey me to the first part of my journey, was packed to capacity with 15 porters and some 1,000 pounds of luggage. This journey of some 55 miles from Ranikhet to the village of Gurur was along narrow roads, the hairpin bends in which were innumerable and acute, and the driver drove on the principle that no obstacle was to be encountered on the corners, and if it was, Providence must decide the issue. Fortunately, Providence was well disposed, and apart from some hectic encounters with stray cows and bullocks cart, the drive was uneventful. The foothills of the Himalayas provide the perfect introduction to the snows, and their gentle forest clad undulations lead the eye forward to the background of gigantic peaks, which distance serves to increase, not diminish in beauty. After following for some miles the clear running Kosi river and passing numerous villages and government resin collecting stations, the road climbed over a high ridge where I saw several trees, rhododendrons, and the distant snows of Trisul and Nanda Devi. Then wound sinuously down to the level floor of the wide Sarju Valley. Garur, the terminus of the motor road, is a sordid little place, like any native place to which civilization has penetrated disguised in the forms of motor cars. Flies swarmed over the offal in the street, beggars whined for alms, and from one of the single story hovels, a cheap gramophone wheezed drearily. There is no doubt that the farthest flung tentacles of civilization debase, not improve human condition. However, like Mr. Gandhi, I might damn motor cars, but I had not hesitated to employ one. I turned my back gladly on the place with its smells, the immemorial and romantic smells of the East, which are compounded quite simply of the effluvium from an inadequate drainage system and unwashed human bodies mingled in the present instance with a reek of oil and petrol, and set off on the first stage of my march. For the next few months, I should neither see nor hear nor smell a motor car or aeroplane. It was a stimulating thought. Beyond Gurur, the path crosses the Sarju river by a well built suspension bridge. Then, after sundry ups and downs, begins a long climb to the Gwaldam Dak Bungalow. It was a hot march. The temperature cannot have been much less than 100 degrees in the shade, and the docials poured there with sweat. How they managed to carry their 80-pound loads, I do not know. I felt a slave driver, but it is possible I estimated their efforts my own incapacities. For I had left Ranikhet with a temperature of 101 degree and a feverish chill. This may have been unwise, but I am convinced that the best way of ridding myself of a chill is to walk it off and sweat it out. I suddenly must have accomplished the latter, as I was fat and flabby after many months of sedentary living. The foothills of central Himalayas are poor in flowers owing to the forest of cheer, Pinus longifolia, which cover the ground in carpet of needles, thus preventing the growth of plants or germination of seed. Yet these forests have a charm of their own, for the cheer is a fine tree, and though it has few branches and casts little shade, grows straight and true to a considerable height. Furthermore, trees are well spaced, and owing to the absence of clogging undergrowth or lag grass, the country resembles a well kept parkland. Lastly, the cheer is highly resinous and the air is fragrant in its neighborhood. In normal circumstances, it is enjoyable walk to Gwaldam, but that day it was matter of setting my teeth and plugging on with a hurting head. aching limbs, and thirst which I satisfied rigorously at every spring. So at last, after 10 miles walk and an ascent of some 4,000 feet, I emerged from the forest on the ridge where the bungalow stands overlooking the haze-filled depths of the Pindar Valley to the remote gleam of the Himalayan snows. Two Englishmen were encamped near the bungalow. Mr. G. W. H. Davidson, the headmaster of Colvin Talikudar College, Lucknow, who had with him one of his Indian pupils, and Major Matthews of the Royal Engineers, and their knowledge and hospitality had much to do with my rapid recovery from my chill. For I went to bed with an excellent dinner and considerable quantity of whisky inside me, and woke miraculously better next morning. From Gwaldam, a forest path descends steeply into the Pindar Valley. We were away early soon after the sun had fired the snow, and an hour later had descended 3,000 feet to the Pindar River. About halfway to the village of Tharali, I met with another Englishman, Corporal Hamilton, a member of a party of soldiers of the East Surrey Regiment who were at this time attempting to ascend Kamet. Unfortunately, he had damaged his arm, which had become poisoned, and I had with me a comprehensive medical kit. I was able to disinfect and bind up the wound, which was already been treated with Indian doctor. The expedition in which he took part is one of the most remarkable in the annals of Himalayan mountaineering. The soldiers who were led by Corporal Ralph Ridley after an expedition the previous summer to the Arva Valley glacier system boldly descended to attempt Kamet in 1937. Their organization was admirable, and they failed primarily through lack of sufficient porterage after overcoming the greatest difficulties to the route and reaching a height of 23,700 feet. At the same time, to attempt a major peak, even though it has been climbed before, it is unwise without adequate mountaineering experience. There are peaks of all heights and shades of difficulty in Himalayas where the novice may learn the craft. Nature is intolerant of ignorance, and he who attempts to greater peaks of Himalayas without having acquired the delicacy and acuteness of perception, that instinctiveness feeling for his task, will sooner or later blunder to disaster. This is not meant to detract from the merit of an expedition which was conspicuous for the initiative and self-reliance displayed, but merely to the point out the advisability of preliminary preparation in mountaineering. It is to be hoped that future mountaineering expeditions will receive the encouragement of the High Command. Tharali hurdles at the foot of a knoll thrusting forward into the Pindar River, which narrows considerably at this point. The village was devastated by a flood in summer of 1936. 20 inches of rain fell in one day, and the Pindar River, unable to discharge its surplus water through the narrow portion of the valley, rose and flooded the village, destroying a number of houses and drowning 40 of the inhabitants. The usual camping ground is a strip of sun-scorched turf by the river, but I preferred the partial shade of some pines on the knoll near the village school, which sports large notices over every approach to the effect that all are welcome. Ineffective propaganda to judge from the absence of pupils, but perhaps it was a holiday. The afternoon was the hottest I have ever remembered. My tent, which was only 6.5 feet long by 4 feet wide, was intolerable. So I lay outside it on a mattress in the scanty shade of pines, plagued by innumerable flies. Evening brought little relief, and the sun set in a furnace like glare. The night was breathless, but I managed to sleep only to be awakened through shortly before midnight by flickering lightning and reverberating concussions of thunder. The storm was confined to the hills and passed after an hour, leaving a dull red glow in the sky, presumably the reflection of a forest fired by lightning. I breakfasted early and was away at 5 o'clock, anxious to break the back of the long march to Saptal, which entails some 12 miles of walking and 5,000 feet of ascent. The storm had done nothing to clear the air, and the forest was charged with damp, enervating heat, so that it was a relief to emerge from them after 2 hours. Walking was on to more open slopes, where village of Dungri perches below a basin-like rim of hills. The air here was cooler, and men and women were working energetically in the terraced field scratching shallow furrows with primitive wooden plows drawn by oxen or buffaloes. The men greeted me in a friendly way, and the children gazed at me curiously, imprudently, or shyly in the manner of children the world over. But the nose beringed women I met with on the path hastened by with averted faces. At one hamlet, a man ran out of house, saluted with military precision, and offered to carry my rucksack. Doubtless, many another in this country, he had served with the Garhwal or Kumaun rifles. Forest of Cheer, open country, artificially deforested, then rhododendrons, deciduous trees, spruces, and firs in the natural upward order of growth in the lower foothills were crops flourished best in the temperature zone from 4,000 to 8,000 feet. I entered the cool forests above Dungri and seating myself on a mosey back ate my lunch of biscuits and potatoes. I was far ahead of the porters. The forest was presumably profoundly silent, and great clouds were slowly building up in the sky of steely oxidized blue. Not even in the Sikkim forest have I ever seen finer tree rhododendrons, and there was one moss-clad giant which cannot have been less than 5 feet in diameter. How many centuries had these trees endured? Long before the wooden ships of the company sailed to India, they must have established themselves on the knees of the Himalayas. Beyond my luncheon place, I had a glimpse of a brown bear as it leapt from the path, a little fellow who was gone in the flash. After this, the path mounted at a restful angle and passing over a brow descended to a stream issuing from a rocky rift. There was a deep pool, and I stripped and bathed gaspingly at first in the ice cold water, then dried myself on a flat rock in the sun. While I was engaging in this, a small boy passed and catching sight of me bolted precipitately up in the path, then halted to eye me with a fearful curiosity. Probably he had never seen a European before, and at all events, anyone who had bathed in an ice cold water was indubitably mad. The camping ground at Saptal, the name given to an extensive pasture, is a sparsely wooden ridge which rises on either hand to hills densely forested in spruce and the Himalayan oak, which is a narrow spreading tree as compared with English oak. To the north of the ridge falls away into a branch valley of Nandakani Valley, through which the western glaciers of Trisul pour their waters into the Alaknanda River. It was not yet midday, but the sky was thick and gathering storm clouds, and the earth lay still and the silent beneath a weight of lurid haze. The porters were long in arriving, but it was a marvel that they should have arrived at all, considering to the weight of their loads, the distance and the climb. If my mathematics was not too rusty, the energy required to lift a human body plus an extra of 80 pounds of weight through nearly a mile of fight comes to a well of 10 lakh foot pound, of which the load amounts to about 4 lakh foot pounds. In the terms of load alone, it is equivalent to shoveling over 75 tons of coal into a furnace. Meanwhile, a party of traders with a dozen of pony had halted close by and lit a fire after carefully stacking their merchandise under a tarpaulin. Presently, one of them, seeing that I was alone, asked me if I would care for some food. It was a generous thought, but I had no need to deplete their probably slender supplies. This was only one instance of the kindliness of people of this country, and it seemed to me that the human atmosphere of Garhwal and Kumaon was very different to what it had been in 1931. Is Mr. Gandhi's creed of non-violence bearing the fruit of sympathy, tolerance and understanding, or is a more positive and less vacillating British rule responsible? Whatever it is, one thing is certain: only through cooperation, friendship, and mutual respect between British and Indian races is any real and lasting benefit for either to be achieved. In India, in that distant future, when education and evolution will have emancipated the Indian people from their straggling social and religious prejudices. The early afternoon darkened gradually, and in the close sultry atmosphere, flies attacked me venomously. The haze deepened until it was difficult to perceive where the hills ended and the clouds began. A rust colored light invested the forest, then faded at the last oasis of blue sky, was swallowed by the chaotic and enormous thunder cloud, and the far north, where the Himalayas lay, began to shudder with long muffled reverberation of thunder. At 2 o'clock, the porters struggled into camp, soaked with sweat and very tired. As the Darjeeling men pitched the tents, one for me and one for themselves, heavy drops of rain were splashing into the forest, and the thunder was rumbling continuously, and through a column of tanks and guns was crossing a hollow sounding bridge. Soon lightning was flickering and stabbing through a blue wall of advancing rain, smeared dull white with hail, and the thunder was tearing overhead like a giant rending endless strips of calico. Then above the thunder I heard a dull roar, rising in the strength and pitch every instant, and almost before I had time to realize it, meaning the thin topped spruces 100 yards distance bent like whipping lashes, and terrific squalls of wind and hail rifted by massive sword of lightning and fearful explosion of thunder burst it into wild fury on the camp. This first blast of storm did not last long, and half an hour later the rain stopped and the wind died into a damp calm smelling of wet earth and vegetation. Through the storm had retreated from the immediate vicinity of Saptal, the thunder continued, coming from every direction and without pause, a single tremendous sound that grew and ebbed and grew again in concussion that seemed to shake the hills to their foundations. The storm was working up for another climax when Nurbu brought me my supper, which Devang had artfully cooked in shelter of a hollow tree. Afterwards, I lay in my sleeping bag and watched through the entrance of the tent the finest display of lightning I have ever seen. The whole sky was continuously blazing with more fire, and it was possible to read uninterruptedly from the book. Slowly the lightning grew in brilliance, and that were possible, and the thunder in volume. There was no This was no ordinary storm, even in the district where storms are frequent, and I wish I had moved the tents after the first storm. Though with the ridges on the either side of the camp, there did not seem any likelihood of danger. There was no time to do anything now, and at 9 o'clock the storm was again upon us in a hurricane of winds, hail, and rain, punctuated every second by blinding lightning and terrible explosion of thunder. Lightning, when it strikes close to the observer, does not make the noise we conventionally term thunder, or even rending, rearing noise already mentioned, but a single violent explosion, a bang like a powerful bomb. I had no hesitation in admitting that I was thoroughly scared, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, I could have sworn that streams of fire flickered along the ridges of the tent and down the lateral gay rope. The worst was over within an hour, and I went outside to see how the Docials had fared for. I had feared that one or another of the tree beneath which they were sheltered had been struck. To my great relief, they were all safe, though even the irrepressible Wang Di, who together with Pasang, Nurbu, and Tewang had been in the other tent, seemed a trifle shaken by their experience. This was the last of the storm so far as it is concerned us, but long afterward the sky flamed with lightning and thunder surrounded the range. I am not exaggerating when I state that I do not remember a second pause in the sound of the thunder during the total period of 8 hours. The sky next morning was cloudless, but the dense haze concealed the view I had hoped to obtain of the snows. We were away as the sun touched the camp and descended through cool and fragrant forests, alive with song of birds to cultivated slope and small villages. Then into the wooded valley with a stream of clear running water. Here, at about 7,000 feet on an open slope, I saw the first time little Iris Camounensis, which I knew I would meet with later on the Kauri Pass in the Bhayandar Valley. I also came upon hundreds of largest cobwebs I have ever seen. For a mile the trees and shrubs had suspended between them vast net, wet and shining after the rain, and spider waiting for its breakfast in the center of each. So strong were the webs that stout twigs to which they were affixed were bent at right angles, while the largest was stretched between two trees fully 12 feet apart and had its spinner a spider about 6 inches in width from tip to tip of its hairy leg. At the village of Ghat, which is situated in the deep Nandakni valley, a single room dark bungalow destitute of furniture did not attract me, and I preferred to camp by the river. The tent had scarcely been pitched when thunder began to growl again, and a mass of inky clouds advanced quickly down the valley. A few minutes later, I was astonished to see a wreathing column of spray appear round a bend and the river and descend on the camp. Next moment, up went my tent, wrenching the metal tent pegs away as though they were matches, and swept along the ground into the river. Yelling to the men, I threw myself on it, and a few moments later I was joined by Wang Di, Nurmu, Pasang, all shouting with laughter, evidently convinced that the whirlwind was a huge joke. Later the weather improved and I supped in calm of a perfect evening. I had no official cook. Experience has taught me that official cooks are to be avoided in Himalaya, as they are almost invariably dirty and born twisters and scroungers. Worst of all, they are impervious to insult, sarcasm, or righteous anger, and like their European prototypes, resent the best intentioned suggestions and advice. Furthermore, they are set in their habits, and their habits are vile, and lastly they are invariably bad cooks, or so my experience goes, and are largely responsible for the stomach troubles that beset Himalayan expeditions. Therefore, I had left it to the men to decide between themselves as to which of them should cook for me, and Tewang had elected himself or had been elected to the post. To write that he was a good cook, which implies the exercise of imagination and fertility of the invention would be to overstate his abilities. He was a simple, plain cook, so plain that his cooking would have palled at an early date or on an appetite less voracious than mine. His most artistic culinary flight was rissoles, which he would produce these with one of his rare smiles, creasing his broad face, and exaggerated pride worthy of conjurer who has outmasked masculined his own professors. But he cooked what he did cook well, and I seldom had cause to reproach him on his score. So having seen that he has clean and doubtful water was boiled, and the dish cloth was used in preference to the tail of the shirt, I left him to his own devices. The Dorshals were averse to proceeding to Joshimath via the Kauri Pass, and they justly pointed out the route from Ghat via Nandprayag and Alaknanda Valley is considerably easy. I had, however, no intentions of proceeding by the route, which is very hot and at times fever ridden, in preferences to the cool, healthful, and beautiful high level route via the Kauri Pass. And when I pointed out the disadvantage of the former route, their objections soon resolved themselves into good humoured grumblings. From Ghat, the path crossed the Nandakini river by the strongly built suspension bridge, then zigzags up a steep and arid hillside. Some 2500 feet up is perched on a grassy spur a small village, the inhabitants of which greeted me cheerfully. Their lives are spent like the lives of most people of this country in agricultural pursuits. A spring and summer of intense activity devoted to the task of levelling their little fields on the steep hillside, removing innumerable stones and building them into walls so that the monsoon rains do not wash the precious soil into the valley. Turning the thin soil into wooden ox drawn ploughs, sowing, reaping, and threshing is followed by a winter of comparatively inactivity. Scarcely less strenuous is the work of the shepherds deputed to drive the flocks to the upper pastures, which are so few and scanty that the owners must take it in turns to graze them. There is the life of mountain peasant in the world. There is the life of mountain peasant the world over. A struggle against adverse forces, yet forces that once tamed will yield, if not bountiful, at least enough to maintain a fit and hardy race. A dull, monotonous life, perhaps a minute life cycle of work and rest, but running through it all the all the never-ending thread of human propagation and continuity. These dwarf peasants may be outwardly insensible to their tremendous environment, but the vast hills that everlastingly mocked their puny efforts, the deep valley and their rush of glacial waters bearing onwards to the far distant plains, the remote glimmer of the high snow have become a part of them, and deep in their inmost selves must rest a love, respect, and reverence of their unrelentingly taskmasters, the Himalayas. From the village, the path mounted an open hillside to a ridge clothed with oaks and tree rhododendrons. I lunched in a glade which commanded a view between the trees of Trisul and a vast barrier of shining snow at the head of the deeply cut Nandakini valley, whose ribbon-like stream thousands of feet beneath me twisted and turned between the bare shoulders of the hills. The air was fresh, and only the whirring and humming of the insects fell on the profound stillness. All around me grew a pale mauve daisy, while on the slope below was a carmist with rosette-like silvery foliage and blue flowers, some of which were already in seed. Presently the porters appeared. They were singing, and their simple little songs echoed through the silent glades of the forest, somehow partook of the beauty and majesty of the surroundings, Complicated music would be out of the place where everything is simple and sublime. Beyond the glade, the path traversed a forest-clad hillside, then emerged up on the open slopes terraced with fields where the little village of Ramni perched. Our camping place was on the turfs close cropped by the village animals, but not eaten so short as to destroy the brilliant blue flowers of tiny Gentians capitata. In 1931, we had been pestered by flies at the Katuni, but on this occasion, a mosquito net over the entrance of my tent enabled me to escape their hateful intentions. It was a hot afternoon, but the evening was delightfully cool. The flies disappeared, and with no midges or mosquitoes to take their place, I ate my supper in peace beneath the accumulating stars.